Luffy needs a major power-up to reach Joy Boy's level and surpass Imu, and we already have all the signs pointing to what this next power-up is going to be. And no, it is not Gear 6. Regardless of whether it is coming by the end of Elbaf or Oda is saving it for the final war, Oda has already spelled out blatantly word for word in the manga exactly what Luffy's next power-up is going to be, and so today we're going to be breaking down what Oda told us, the trigger that should get Luffy to that next step, and the point in the story that he is most likely to achieve it. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. But first, you can get 9 more of your favorite One Piece characters for your wall. We have 9 new dynamically illustrated One Piece legends with 9 hidden iconic moments. Get Proud Whitebeard with a hidden final stand. Get Noble Katakuri with a hidden sacrifice. Get Legendary Kuma with a hidden dance. And plenty more along with our legends from before. And this month only, for any 2 posters you can get 2 more free and Blackwing Emu for free, with the deal auto-applied at checkout. This deal is only running for this month, and Blackwing Emu will never be available again. So make sure you get your deal now by hitting the link in the description below. So that aside, to begin with, let's get this out of the way. The next power-up for Luffy is very unlikely to be Gear 6th. In fact, the core concept of Gear 5th inherently suggests that there's never going to be another gear. There is probably not ever going to be a Gear 6th. If we just consider what Gear 5th represents in terms of stages of Luffy's journey, well, Gear 5th already represents the fully realized version of Luffy's powers. See, narratively, Luffy's power progression has always been about slowly stretching and stretching the limits until finally he reached the point of Gear 5th where he could break all limits. Initially, Luffy's abilities are simply rubber. He goes through most of pre-time skip just kicking, punching, stretching. As he faces stronger and stronger opponents, he becomes more creative with how he can apply his rubber abilities, as we see against Crocodile and Enel. But finally, when he feels that he's starting to hit his limits, that's when Luffy invents the concept of gears. And now he begins to stretch the concept of rubber further and further. What if he can use this rubber body to manipulate his blood, like in Gear 2, or his bones, like in Gear 3, or his muscles, like in Gear 4? The power of rubber is innately a playground for creativity. You can mold it and change it in so many different ways. But no matter what, there is a limit. Rubber will always snap back. So as we've seen Luffy progress over the course of the series, becoming more and more creative with more and more ways to abuse his rubber powers, literally and symbolically stretching them to their absolute conceptual limits, once Luffy finally tapped out everything that his rubber abilities could innately do, finally the limiter was removed. Now Luffy's stretching no longer has to abide by the laws of logic. He can freely change shape, transform, no longer simply stretching himself, but actually stretching the laws of reality themselves. As we've been told, the only way Luffy is limited at this point is his own imagination. What we're looking at right now with Gear 5th should already be the final version of Luffy's fruit. If you just think about why Luffy had to create gears in the first place, Gear 6th inherently makes no sense, because Luffy was coming up with the gears of Gear 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in the first place to push past the limits of what he could do. But Gear 5th finally doesn't have limits anymore. If Gear 5th is the power of Luffy's imagination, then whatever he would imagine as a sort of power-up that could be Gear 6th, well, he can just do that already in Gear 5th. Like, whatever you imagine Gear 6th to be, that should be something that Luffy can turn into in Gear 5th already. I mean, if Luffy wants to become gigantic, he can do that. If he wants to create a fist the size of an island, he can do that. If he wants to turn into random stuff like a genie, then sure, he can do that as well. Like, whatever form you imagine that Luffy needs to turn into next to become stronger, the logic of Gear 5th is he can just do that already in the form that he has right now, Gear 5th. Meaning there shouldn't really be any further need for gears. And keep in mind, when Luffy unlocked Gear 5th, he outright tells us that this is it. This is his peak. I personally believe that that is Oda telling us, the reader, that this is the peak of what we can expect from his Devil Fruit. Luffy can do and imagine whatever the hell he wants. What more could you really ask for in terms of power-ups from his fruit? Like, yeah, maybe you could imagine Luffy doing even bigger and crazier attacks with Gear 5th, but we've reached a point in the story where I think it's kind of being made clear that that's not the area in which Luffy's lacking. Doing even bigger and crazier attacks with his Devil Fruit isn't going to get him past Imu. When Luffy does the gigantic Majin Sucker Punch attack on Imu, and Imu blocks it so casually, it no longer really seems like the Devil Fruit is the problem. Essentially, we're at a point where Luffy's abilities with his Devil Fruit are theoretically limitless. He has outright told us that this is his peak. Symbolically, Gear 5 represents the final evolution of what Luffy's powers represent in the story so far. It's hard to imagine something that a new gear would do for Luffy that Gear 5th can't already do. The brutal reality that seems to be setting in at this point, that the story seems to be highlighting, is that we are past the point where Luffy's fruit can do the work for him. Luffy could imagine a form twice as big as the Majin, or 10 times as big as the Majin. That's not what's gonna put down Imu. And this is not just my interpretation of what the story is telling us. Oda outright told us this when Luffy got Gear 5th in the first place. When Luffy first got Gear 5th and he was running wild with all the crazy new abilities and possibilities, and it seemed like he was running over Kaido, Kaido started fighting back. And he gave Luffy a very clear and explicit reminder that seems like it was not just directed at Luffy, but also was a signpost for the readers, which is that it does not matter how strong your Devil Fruit is. At the end of the day, Haki transcends all. It was spelled out for us, right there in Gear 5th's introduction. Even if Luffy wins this fight against Kaido, he cannot be King of the Seas unless he has the Conqueror's Haki to match the absurd power of his fruit. And that statement by Kaido was immediately backed up the very next arc in Egghead Island, where in Egghead Island we were shown plain as day the difference between Luffy and Joy Boy. The difference between Luffy and Joy Boy is not the fruit. Luffy with the Nika Fruit Awakening is like a fish in water. It just comes so naturally to him. We have never once gotten a hint that Joy Boy had access to some special applications of this power that Luffy can't yet do. I'm sure Joy Boy probably was more adept at using the fruit just through sheer virtue of experience, but so far the narrative has not been highlighting a difference in terms of Luffy's capability of using the fruit. What Kaido highlighted in the first place is that Luffy is lacking the Haki to go along with the fruit of this power, and then Egghead Island confirmed that, where we saw Joy Boy's Haki knot unleash the most extreme display of Conqueror's Haki ever before seen in the series, outright overwhelming all of the Gorosei at once, whereas Luffy had been forced to flee from them and was unable to even scratch Walkiri, and at the same time Joy Boy's Haki left Imu in a cold sweat. And that is a huge tip-off that Haki really is the key to all of this. Imu just called Luffy weak, and said that Joy Boy would never be this weak. Luffy has the same awakened fruit as Joy Boy, but we know the thing that Luffy is lacking is the Haki that Joy Boy displayed at Egghead Island. Whereas Imu was deeply affected by Joy Boy's Haki from even beyond the grave, Luffy's full-strength, giant-sized, Gear 5th Conqueror's Haki-coded attacks do absolutely nothing to Imu. He can block it with one hand even while distracted. There really doesn't seem to be some secret that's being missed here. It's been the same exact message arc after arc ever since Luffy unlocked the Nika Fruit. In Wano, we were told that the limits are now off, Luffy can do whatever he wants with the fruit, Luffy feels like he's reached the peak of his Devil Fruit abilities, and then Kaido tells him that this does not matter because Haki is what matters, Haki transcends all. The next arc, we are shown that Joy Boy's Conqueror's Haki is far beyond Luffy's, and is the key to doing the things that Luffy currently cannot. And finally in Elbaf, we were outright shown that no matter what tricks Luffy does with his fruit, the actual power, the Haki behind his attacks, is not strong enough to hurt Imu. And that is why Imu calls Luffy weak, and that is also precisely the area where Luffy needs to take a huge step forward. And this makes perfect sense if you're looking at the themes of Elbaf overall. This arc so far has centered around messaging about Conqueror's Haki. One by one, Oda is going through the monster trio and establishing that they are not yet the Conqueror's Haki users that they need to be. Sanji needs to awaken his Conqueror's Haki spirit in order to be the type of king that is worthy to be a wing of the Pirate King. Zoro needs to gain control of his Conqueror's Haki, because without control of his Conqueror's Haki, he cannot be considered a true master of the ability. And that finally brings us to Luffy, who despite being capable with Conqueror's Haki, has been told and shown repeatedly that this is the one area in which he is greatly lacking compared to his predecessor Joy Boy. And it finally all came to a head against Imu, where it was outright shown that the gap between Luffy's Conqueror's Haki and Joy Boy's is what is currently making Luffy seem so weak in comparison. And the time has finally come that Kaido's words are coming back to haunt him. Just as much as Sanji needs a Conqueror's Haki bloom here, Just as much as Zoro needs a Conqueror's Haki Bloom here, so too has it been vividly established that Luffy finally needs another Conqueror's Haki Bloom here. And again, thematically it all makes sense if you just think about the broader themes of the series. The Nika fruit is an ability that was handed to Luffy. Yes, Luffy's worked hard to push it to its limits and awaken it, but ultimately this power has been bestowed upon him as a gift. Now the Nika fruit chose him because he is worthy, but that means that Luffy as a character in isolation separate from the Nika fruit should be worthy to be king of the seas. He should have the strongest Conqueror's Haki on the seas, just as Joy Boy did. Luffy shouldn't be the strongest because of his fruit. That would go against all the messaging of One Piece about the strength of ambition and will in terms of achieving your goals. No, the fruit should have chosen him because it recognized him as the strongest. The fruit that Luffy has been given should always ultimately be a bonus. An amazing, spectacular bonus, but a bonus nonetheless. His true core strength should always be his own innate drive and conviction. And that has been the message from the very beginning of One Piece, and it is why Oda has reiterated over and over that at the end of the day, it is Haki that transcends all. So if Luffy still needs a huge step forward in terms of Conqueror's Haki, what context would this play out in? So to begin with, a lot of people might be feeling like, okay Morge, Luffy could get a big Conqueror's Haki Bloom, but that still shouldn't be enough to get him to Imu's level, or beyond it. But I think people are forgetting just how absurd Conqueror's Haki Blooms are. Haki Blooms can be as strong as Oda wants them to be. To put it into context, with a single Haki Bloom, Luffy went from losing a Haki clash with Ulti, a Tobi Roppo, to literally splitting the sky with Kaido. That is one Haki Bloom. You might say that Luffy should need multiple Haki Blooms to go from his current level to Joy Boy's Haki, but there isn't really any sort of established math or formula to this. As long as Oda writes a scenario that is dramatic and triggering enough, Oda could literally write Luffy's next big Haki Bloom as reaching Joy Boy's Haki Knot level. And that would logically be the level where Luffy could now probably damage Imu. This huge leap forward in Conqueror's Haki would also logically have Luffy transcend Roger, thereby finally making Luffy a worthy pirate king, as Kaido previously foreshadowed. The only two questions are whether or not this Haki Bloom will happen in Elbaf or in the final war, and really whether it'll happen against Imu or against Blackbeard. Now, as you can see in my previous video that I put out last week, I don't actually think that Luffy is done for in Elbaf. And I also personally lean towards Imu being the penultimate villain and Blackbeard being the true final villain. So now we're getting into very speculative territory. But if I had to guess, I lean towards the possibility of Luffy having a big Conqueror's Haki Bloom towards the end of Elbaf that is at the very least impactful in the broader battle against Imu. And then I feel like in the final war, we may see Luffy have to actually master this ability in order to become his fully realized self and defeat Blackbeard. However, there are plenty of alternate routes. For example, maybe Luffy just is outright defeated by Imu in this arc. Maybe Luffy gets his huge Conqueror's Haki Bloom against Blackbeard, which would arguably be fitting, as the Yami Yami no Mi would inherently counteract most of Luffy's Devil Fruit abilities, potentially forcing Luffy to have to win through Haki alone, which would be the absolutely ideal scenario for a gigantic Conqueror's Haki Bloom. And then the fully realized version of Luffy, who now has the Awakened Nika Fruit and Joy Boy levels Conqueror's Haki, then gets his run back against Imu as perhaps the final villain of the story and defeats him. Or perhaps there's a middle ground where Luffy does get back up in the Elbaf arc and is a huge factor in perhaps a team battle against Imu, but Oda's still saving that final Joy Boy level Conqueror's Haki Bloom for the upcoming perhaps final battle against Blackbeard in the final war. So let me know in the comments below in what context you think Luffy is going to get his final big Conqueror's Haki Bloom, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear my theory as to the exact emotional trigger that will cause Luffy to have his final big Conqueror's Haki Bloom, then you can listen to my weekly podcast that just dropped by becoming a member or by supporting me on Patreon. Link in the description below.